Battle Brothers was released back in 2017 by Overhype Studios, and it has since gathered a reputation for being one of the best games in its genre, as well as being a brutally difficult, unforgiving experience. Well, I've now spent over 100 hours in the game, and I want to tell you why one of those two statements is just not true. Battle Brothers is a game about managing a mercenary company. You start out on a randomly generated map, where there will be a couple of great houses controlling castles, cities and villages, with each of these having a couple of buildings attached to them. For example, a small village with a pig farm will be a great place to stock up on food, whereas a stone keep with a barracks and ore smelters will be a good place to buy armor and hire men with combat experience. The world is populated by all kinds of actors. Trading caravans will travel between settlements, bandits will try to ambush them, so the local lords' armies will patrol the roads to try and keep them safe, and on top of that, because this is a low fantasy setting, sometimes it's not bandits running around, but it's orcs, or the undead, or horrible beasts looking for a quick snack. The world of Battle Brothers is dangerous, gritty, and generally miserable to live in, which luckily happen to be the perfect conditions for starting a mercenary company. You play as its commander, making all the important strategic decisions, from giving out orders in battle to negotiating contracts with nobles and making sure your men stay in fighting condition. Your player character never actually fights in combat himself, as unlike all the other flashbacks in your employ, your genius is, of course, irreplaceable. So you travel the land, making a living, solving the many problems of this world, or creating more of them. It's up to you, it's a sandbox. If you've ever played Mount & Blade, this part of the game is extremely similar. Most of the contracts you undertake will inevitably lead to combat, which is turn-based, and whenever you attack or are attacked, there is the infamous percentage hit chance based on your and the enemy's stats. And you shouldn't expect to sling fireballs at people. It is fantasy, but very grounded. The fights are, the majority of the time, close range, steel against steel. We are going to deep dive into the mechanics of the combat, but first I want to talk about some of the other things that Battle Brothers does right. I was pleasantly surprised at how good the atmosphere is in this game, because at first glance the characters look a little goofy. There are very few animations for them, they don't have any arms or legs, and certain armors make their body look like an egg. But because these are used everywhere for all enemies, whether they are humanoid or beast, and even in events, people are represented by these tokens, so it very quickly starts feeling perfectly normal. And the advantages of this system are immense. All the equipment in the game changes how your character looks, and it's all beautifully painted with tons of small details, while still providing a lot of information to the player. The weapons and armor are all easily distinguishable, and as the battle progresses, you will see the armor being damaged or injuries and bloodstains, so the art style is more than capable of fully immersing you in these battles. The other part of this is the absolutely incredible sound design, because despite the very limited visible movement, when you attack with a character, the weapons feel lethal. Depending on the weapon type and on whether you hit the shield, armor or flesh, you get different sounds, and successfully landing hits feels extremely satisfying, while narrowly dodging or being hit feels accurately terrifying. This is of course also aided by the screams of pain, agony and despair as you mangle each other. It is just superb. On top of that, you have a very powerful soundtrack. There are a lot of great somber themes for traveling on the world map, but the soundtrack really shines during the battles. There are different tracks for different types of enemies, and they all tell their own story and give a very different feel to fighting regular bandits. versus an unending horde of undead. Or the fearless, bloodthirsty orcs. And the last piece of the atmosphere is the writing in this game. As you travel the world, you will have various events happen to you, and while you always have the option to just scroll down, see what happened and move on, they flesh out the world really well and give you a pretty clear idea of who you play and what the hierarchy is. You are not heroes or villains, your allegiance is only to the most powerful master, Coin, and your morals sometimes have to step aside. Clearly a lot of effort went into these events, and it is vital because this is as much story as you are going to get. Battle Brothers is meant to be endlessly replayable, so there is no main narrative or cutscenes, it's bits and pieces that connect to create your own legend, and it's always the correct decision for games like this. I still vividly remember my first battle against a necromancer. This was during my first few hours. I was outnumbered by the undead, but luckily I just barely managed to fall back to a small hill where the terrain stopped the zombies from being able to surround me. And at first I thought I'm a tactical genius and it's the perfect plan. But then the necromancer simply sat back and kept reviving the zombies over and over, no matter how many times I slew them. So I decided to send a team of 3 to flank around the hill while the rest of my men held off the horde. And they ran into some stragglers, but turn by turn, this heroic trio made their way forward. The cowardly necromancer realized that this is not a fight he's going to win, so he sent his 2 bodyguards to delay us while he started running away. But, yet again, I was 1 step ahead of him. As I gained the upper hand on the hill, I released my warhounds, which might not be the most powerful fighters, but they can close distance extremely quickly. And just as the necromancer was about to reach the edge of the map, which would mean he gets to run away, the hounds caught up to him and held him down until Oscar could deliver 1 final mighty swing of his axe, decapitating him. That battle felt like a movie. On the opposite side of the spectrum, I also vividly remember the most disastrous battle I've ever had. It was a routine contract to destroy a bandit camp, like I've done many times before, only when I arrived, I caught these bandits dealing with members of the assassin cult, 2 of them to be precise. I of course did have the option to simply walk away, but my company had a reputation to uphold, and really, how bad can 2 assassins be? The first casualty was one of my veterans, who has been with me since the very beginning. Heavily armored and holding a massive greatsword, he was the perfect frontliner, or so I thought, until I watched him get annihilated in just a couple of seconds. He was gone. Death in Battle Brothers is permanent. 1 miscalculation or simply someone having a bad day and it's over. This was a very bad day. My men struggled to hit the lightly armored, nimble warriors, and the assassins used dazing bombs, making it even more difficult. Yeah, that was my other veteran soldier, carrying some of the best gear I had, gone just like that. Unfortunately, the worst was yet to come, as the assassins pulled out a firebomb and set my men ablaze. Right in the middle of it all, unable to move back, was Wolfgang, by far my most skilled soldier. Using a legendary helmet I found, he was the only truly irreplaceable man in my employ, and I had to watch as the fire melted his armor and flesh, but he wasn't going down without a fight. He eviscerated one of the assassins, opening up space away from the flames, dodged the spear attack of opportunity, and suddenly the tide has turned, as at the same time I broke through their line in the bottom half of the fight. A costly victory, but the company would endure. And then, to my horror, the remaining assassin disengaged from my spear tank, spent a whole turn walking around to get to Wolfgang, and executed him before I could react. That one was painful. The assassin took down another one of my men before finally falling, and I completed the contract, but paid for it with 4 of the best warriors I had. Each good story needs its highs and its lows, and Battle Brothers delivers on this in spades. The memories you will make in this game will stick with you far longer than almost any crafted story could. Now it's finally time to get into the mechanics, how it works, why it's so good, and how the consensus on this game is wildly inaccurate. One of the best parts of combat in Battle Brothers is that the rules are fairly simple and intuitive. You definitely don't need to study any guides for hours before you get in your first fight. You can learn quickly just by playing. Since the game doesn't really have a tutorial, it's good that it works this way. The combat plays out on a hex-based map. It's randomly generated, but will feature different tactical opportunities based on where you fight. For example, in the forest or in the mountains, you will have a lot more choke points and high ground to hold, whereas on a plain, you are vulnerable from all angles. Battle Brothers is, with small exceptions, all about small skirmishes. You can bring at most 12 brothers into combat, and each one only gets 9 action points every turn, which you have to carefully divide between movement, defense or attacks. The proficiency of a brother is decided by his stats. You have health, melee attack, ranged attack, melee defense, range defense, and initiative. These are self-explanatory. Then you have the always important resolve, which dictates the morale. Routing your enemies is a very common alternate win condition to fights. And the last stat is my favorite, fatigue. Every action in combat has a fatigue cost, which starts out empty and fills up over the course of the fight. If you can't pay the fatigue cost, you can't make that action. It gets reduced by 15 every turn, but as you quickly find out, that's not a lot. This mechanic introduces a whole new dynamic to the combat. You can have a super accurate and evasive character, but it doesn't help all that much if he has to rest for a turn each time he swings his weapon. And if a fight lasts for a long enough time, everyone will eventually get tired, including the enemies, because they play by the exact same rules as you do. And the multiple attacks per turn, constant tactical repositioning combat turns into a desperate brawl of the exhausted, injured survivors. It's great. Fatigue also serves as a balancing act for armor and weapons. The heavier they are, the more they reduce your maximum fatigue, and the more tiring they are to use. What makes me like this mechanic is that it does not lower your stats as you get tired, which I think would make it very annoying. When you are choosing which people to recruit into your company, the only information about them you get is how much they want to get paid and their background, which dictates the starting range of their stats. For example, a cripple or a monk are probably not going to be great fighters, but they will be cheap. The game doesn't explicitly tell you which background gives which stats, but each background has a short, lore-friendly description. 3 of the stats at random then also get 1, 2 or 3 stars, which represent the character's natural talent and make those stats improve much faster. This means if you get lucky, you can even find a beggar who can be trained into a very good mercenary. As your brothers level up, they don't only improve their stats, but they also get perk points. The perk tree is the exact same for everyone, and it does a great job of giving you interesting, meaningful options, while not being overwhelming. It's intuitive that perks giving higher HP and more stats from a shield will be good on a tank, whereas better accuracy and more action points on kill will work well on damage dealers. With experience, you will learn that some of these perks are more generally useful than others, but you can make a viable character even on your first attempt. Despite this simplicity, there are a lot of builds possible. and it's mainly because of a huge variety of weapons. Each weapon type has different abilities and serves a different purpose. For example, spears are the easiest weapons to hit with, making them the ideal weapon for brothers with low melee attack, and they even let you form a spear wall to control the battlefield. The downside is that their damage is fairly low, so maybe you choose axes instead, which are great at biting through armor and can be used to break shields, or perhaps a mace to stun your enemies. And then there are one-handed and two-handed versions, or hybrid weapons, each fitting a slightly different niche, so there's a lot to explore and experiment with here. You might wonder how Battle Brothers handles ranged combat, because the basic rule in all games ever made is that dealing damage from the furthest range possible is always good, since you don't have to put yourself in danger. Battle Brothers has bows, crossbows and throwing weapons, but they do not dominate. First, these are not sniper rifles, so their range is very limited. Second, there is no Overwatch in this game, meaning the ability to end your turn but still immediately attack anything that moves into vision, although you can delay taking your turn with the downside of lowering your initiative for the next turn. Third, you start the combat a little over a full turn of movement apart from the enemy, so if you bring 10 ranged brothers, you will get a really strong initial salvo of projectiles, but then the injured but alive enemy closes the gap and you are in trouble, because you cannot use ranged weapons if an enemy is next to you, and you can't get away from them because all melee weapons get an attack of opportunity on anyone trying to walk away. And if that attack hits, it cancels the movement while taking your action points. So it's a huge risk that's almost never worth it. Also, once the enemy closes the gap to your front line, you can't easily shoot at them without risking friendly fire. You can also choose to fight at night, which gives a debuff, making it much harder to hit things from range. All of this combined does a great job at mitigating the power of ranged weapons. They are still extremely powerful, but you absolutely need a front line, and most of the fighting will usually be done in melee. It is really understated just how approachable the combat system in Battle Brothers is. It hooks you in right from your very first battle, while being deep and complex enough to remain very satisfying tens, if not hundreds of hours later. But while the systems might not be too difficult to understand, is the game's balance too difficult to actually enjoy? I generally take issue with games having this badge of a super difficult hardcore game. I think it mostly carries a negative connotation, and it can potentially alienate a part of the player base, as it can feel like you can't enjoy such a game to its fullest unless you completely dedicate yourself to it, and the majority of the time that is simply not true. Obviously, this genre does require you to pay baseline closer attention than something like Subway Surfers, but Battle Brothers does so much to give the player control over their experience and success. Let's start with the difficulty options. You have economic difficulty, which reduces how much you get paid for contracts, and on expert also for selling items. This setting simply slows down the rate of progression. For combat difficulty, easy buffs your hit chance and nerfs the enemies. I find this way of balancing pretty lame, but thankfully veteran simply makes everyone equal, and expert makes the enemy groups have better equipment and or be more numerous, but it does not buff their stats. If you can kill the enemy, you can then use their shiny weapons and armor and be just as powerful. And starting funds does what it says. It indirectly dictates how difficult your first few combats will be. Iron Man, meaning you can't ever load an earlier save, is in my opinion not an option but a requirement. Without the possibility of an absolute disaster, you hurt the story you create, because you will only ever take losses that you are comfortable with, and the victories will never taste as sweet. I did my first campaign on Easy Veteran High Vanilla, and the second on Expert Low with all DLC, and played around 50 hours in each. As far as the actual game goes, in Battle Brothers, it is rare for you to be forced into a battle you don't want to fight. You can usually avoid enemies on the world map, and even in battle, you can try to run away. This gives a temporary morale penalty, so it is far from ideal, but the company will survive. Here I got a contract to eliminate some Nachtzerers. These are frail, weak-willed beasts that usually come in large numbers. The catch is they can feast on any dead bodies to grow larger. A size 2 Nachtzerer is much more dangerous, but I felt confident I could probably deal with 1 or maybe 2. This is a size 3 Nachtzerer. At this point I still had the option to start running, but because the company was low on funds, I decided to make a stand. Yeah, so that was very stupid. It wasn't even close. Luckily, my better equipped brothers managed to get away, and a heavily guarded trading caravan was passing by, which I utilized to help me complete the contract. It is surprisingly difficult to get a game over in Battle Brothers. Your men will die, you will be set back, and you will have to rebuild, but you would need multiple disaster battles in a row to straight up lose, and it feels so good to come back from seemingly hopeless situations. In this same campaign, I ended up with almost no money and barely any food, searching the wilderness for a village offering some hopefully easy work. I got ambushed by bandits. This meant instead of starting in battle lines, it started with me surrounded from every angle. I had no hope of beating them, so I desperately tried to break through one of the sides, and by some miracle, I succeeded. Or rather, the AI decided to just not catch up to one of my men, so we all got out, and slowly but surely I managed to salvage this campaign, although none of the men from this amazing escape are still alive. So these are the combat avoiding options you have, and they give you full control over how you are going to get your men killed. And so we get to the combat difficulty, and to what I think is the crux of the matter. It's why games like Battle Brothers and XCOM have the reputations they do. It's percentages. It is a well-known fact that our brains are very bad at understanding a percentage chance for something to happen. We might understand it logically, but if you miss a 95% chance or multiple high percentage attacks in a row, emotionally we just feel scammed. I vividly remember a couple of instances of a streak of really bad RNG I had. On the other hand, if I would succeed in 10-60% chances in a row, it would feel perfectly normal to me. I mean, those were supposed to hit, right? Of course, I do not remember a single instance of good RNG, not because it didn't happen, but because our brains are just funny like that. I have played a lot of these types of games, and I am still not immune to this phenomenon. But Battle Brothers does a lot to reduce the variance of RNG. You bring 12 brothers to battle, so that's, let's say, 16 attacks per turn. That is a lot for these types of games, and it makes each individual attack less important. I never found myself in a situation where it felt like the outcome of the entire fight hinged on one 80% chance. There are so many dice rolls in a fight that if you chose the right strategy, the right weapons, the right formation, took the high ground or surrounded your enemies for the extra 5% to hit per adjacent ally, you will consistently be rewarded. After the first few battles, you will also have enough armor to not just die to one lucky hit, which gives you time to react and prevent deaths. The swap or disengage perks are really good for this. And even when your men inevitably get slaughtered, there is a 33% chance that they don't die, but instead survive with a permanent injury. Some of these are not so bad, but other times you will have no choice but to send the battered, broken man to an early retirement. I'm sure he'll be fine. I'm not trying to create an illusion about this game being easy, but it feels fair. You can always trace everything that happens to a decision you made. There is one little exception to this: fighting the unknown. All of the enemies in the game have distinct strengths and weaknesses, pushing you to adapt your strategy for best results. If you position incorrectly or fail to play around a special mechanic, you are much more likely to take heavy losses. It makes first encounters feel special and absolutely terrifying. Usually, you will fairly quickly understand the general idea about what you should try to avoid or prevent, but the details are often unclear. It's obvious you want to prevent Nachtserers from eating dead bodies, but what's harder to decipher, unless you look it up, is that this ability costs 6 action points, so if they want to use it, they can only move for 1 tile that turn, which considerably changes how you play these fights. This also extends to weapons, like for example this heavy greatsword. It shares the ability to hit multiple adjacent targets with many other two-handers, but then it also has the unique ability to step through 2 targets in a line. This is one of the highest damage weapons in the game, and it can easily decimate your backliners if you don't play around this. These types of deaths can feel a little cheap, but thankfully it's just a temporary issue since you can loot the weapons from the dead bodies and learn all the different abilities that way. By far the worst case of these surprises comes from the Beasts and Exploration DLC, which adds giant spiders. Even if you initiate combat with them while they are in the forest, which is where they live, you will always start combat ambushed. There is absolutely no precedent for this behavior. Adelmar here spawned in separated from the group and immediately got surrounded. Webnechts excel at taking down isolated targets, so he just died. This felt like the game just decided to kill one of my guys without me being able to do anything about it. It's this sort of uninspired, unfair difficulty that you might expect everywhere based on what people say about this game, but this is the only time I ever encountered it. Since then, I simply pull out Webnechts onto planes, and that seems to work really well. Battle Brothers also sometimes hides information away from the player. For example, when you see enemies on the world map, or when you hover over enemies on the battlefield. I don't mind these because having a general idea is really all you need to make your decisions. Where I don't like it as much is when the game fails to provide information about enemy buffs, debuffs, or injuries. This barbarian has exposed ribs, but what does that do exactly? You can try to make an educated guess, but there's really no reason for why you should have to. There are over 30 injuries in the game, each giving different debuffs. Some of them are crippling, some of them may only have a small impact. So it is important information that you either have to ignore, memorize from when your men get injured, or just look up on the wiki. This orc just gained rage. Alright, so I can tell it's positive. Does he get a higher morale? Maybe he deals and takes more damage, right? Since he's a berserker. You just don't know. I can't think of a good design reason for why this information isn't shown in the game. The point of all this bloodshed is not just to survive. As you build your mercenary company, you will be able to set ambitions for yourself. These are long-term quests that will give your campaign purpose and gain your company renown on completion. If you prove yourself reliable, you will be able to accept contracts from the great houses, which are more lucrative, but also often more dangerous. All of this is preparation for the late game crisis, a world-changing event that will happen after the first roughly 90 days. Each crisis will bring its own special contracts and fights, and some of them, like the Greenskin invasion, can even lead to the destruction of human settlements, which can be permanent depending on your campaign settings. So while it is possible to just ignore the crisis, it's usually not a good idea. They are also just really fun since they offer new gameplay. For example, during the War of the Noble Houses, you can pick a side and then fight alongside your allies in massive battles. When the crisis is resolved, you'll get an event with a little message from the developers where you are told you've won the game and that it is designed for one or two of these late game crises, so you're given the option to retire, ending your campaign. If you choose to continue, another late game crisis will eventually happen, and this process keeps repeating forever. The problem with this system is that retiring after the first crisis feels bad, because at that point your company is finally filled with mostly competent soldiers, you have good equipment, and you are finalizing your character builds, so you want to enjoy getting to that point. But when I continued playing in both of my campaigns, I realized that I'm just getting bored, because I can't really lose the game from that point. I rarely lose any men, and if I do, I have enough gold to replace them with someone better. In short, it suffers from the classic strategy game problem, where late game is just not that fun, because your decisions become so much less important, with way too many resources to respond to any possible complications. There are 3 paid DLCs for Battle Brothers, and they each add some late game content in the form of legendary locations and champion enemies, which are much more powerful versions of normal enemies guaranteed to drop a legendary item. To me, this is not what Battle Brothers is good at, but the DLCs are still very much worth it, because they each also add a lot of variety for the entire run, with new types of contracts, weapons, enemies, and unique starts for your campaign to keep it fresh. Warriors of the North massively expands the northern part of the map with a barbarian faction, Blazing Deserts massively expands the southern part of the map with Arabian, Persian culture-inspired city-states, and Beasts and Exploration adds more beasts everywhere and the option to craft items from them. The new battle music from these is some of the best I've ever heard and makes you want to hunt down the new enemies just to be able to listen to it. Battle Brothers is, without a doubt, one of the best tactical RPGs ever made. It does not offer any revolutionary new mechanics, at least from the perspective of 2024, but it simply refines everything about the genre that works to almost perfection. I didn't even explore the vast modding scene this game has yet, undoubtedly offering countless more hours of fun and even more customization for your experience. If you enjoy strategy, you simply have to play this game.